Welcome Wargamers, Doug here from 2 Plus Tough, and today we are diving into the Nurgle Battle Tome, the Maggotkin of Nurgle that is, and pulling a story out of there to give us a great vision of what Nurgle is like in the era of the Beast. It's certainly something I was curious about because it's really our first depiction of chaos in this new section. Like, how are some of the Chaos Gods responding to this, and what do they think of Kragnos and all those kinds of things? Well, we're going to get into that and more, concluding with our thoughts on what I'm excited for when it comes to the Maggotkin in particular. And right before I get into that, I just want to give a shout out to Not Just Gaming. It's an awesome store on the East Coast here in the States. If you use that link down below, you will save 30% on all Games Workshop purchases and discounts on other stuff as well. And it goes a long way to supporting me as a content creator. It's massively helpful to me, my wife, our cats. Thank you so much to everyone who has used that link before. And now, just as promised, we're going to jump to the Maggotkin of Nurgle Battle Tome and start with a story called The Blighted Beast. Across the realms, the champions of Nurgle feel a quickening in their viscous blood. The cosmos thrashes with violent intent as the hordes of destruction suddenly embark on a massive offensive, spurred into a frenzy by the return of the primordial earthquake god Kragnos. This deity styles himself as the end of empires, and his followers do not care whom they trample. Maggotkin fortresses that only just withstood the undead are assailed again by the hordes. Many fall, even Plaguespire, one of Gurran's mightiest Nurglite citadels, has its outer walls brought down by Grot sappers with no sign of the siege abating anytime soon. In this era of the beast, most Maggotkin can do little but endure, though even their resilience is hard-pressed against such fervor. More enterprising champions deliberately seek out marauding orcs and ogres, prolonging battle until their foes are thoroughly infected before withdrawing into zones of corruption. The barbarous armies soon press on towards the empires of the Maggotkin's rivals, so crazed with battle lust and the resonating energies of the Great Stomp that they don't realize they are now carrying hyper-contagious diseases. Some cruel boy war clans even bargain with Nurgle sorcerers to infect their Grot lackeys so they can send them ahead to weaken prospective foes. Despite the rising threat, Nurgle is pleased. Hundreds of new vectors of contagion now spread far swifter than his own trotting hosts could ever accomplish alone. I think this story ultimately points out the unyielding eternal optimism that is Nurgle. Like, he got really bummed like everybody else did during the necroquake of the Soul Wars because death magic, it just brought everything down, man. But now life is booming. And when life is booming, Nurgle is at his most joyous. Life is abundant, which means that so is entropy given enough time. Whether it's rotting animals that have died because they had a population boom and are now being hunted out, to feed even larger populations of people, like their rotting corpses. Maybe it's just so much fruit from overabundant harvests that now rot because the people literally can't eat it fast enough. Like the ritual of life, which ultimately led to Kragnos' release, which is depicted in the story, is a massive realms-wide setting change. And Nurgle is so up to the task. It just says straight up, like, he's just a happy guy. He's pleased. This is all going according to the plan, right? Things are getting sick. There's more life, which of course means more death, more natural cycles, more things breaking down, and he could not be more stoked about it. There is, however, a problem, because things can't go smoothly, right? This isn't Peacehammer, Age of Peace. The issue is that the way that his armies were conducting themselves in terms of ground warfare before just can't keep up. It used to be that, Nurgle would form these large, implacable armies, and they would just march slowly forward, infecting things as they went. They would attack another fortress, and maybe not actually kill them outright, but certainly plant enough disease to where that fort is going to fall apart on its own anyway, and they would come and conquer it again, and so forth and so on, and just kind of spread slowly over massive swaths of land. They could speed things up faster by corrupting a waterway, perhaps, or maybe a deep well. But Nurgle is not renowned, at least in the lore, for speed. Game-wise, he gets pretty up there. But in lore, it takes a lot of time for these huge sections of land and continents to be conquered and thoroughly corrupted. However, when the Rite of Life goes off, Kragnos is set free, and that has a ripple effect across all of, just destruction armies in general, because they lacked a cohesive, unifying figure. I think the difference between Kragnos and, say, Gordrak, who was kind of before Kragnos slated to be this singular leading body, is Kragnos isn't any one of their species. He's his own thing. Whereas Gordrak, I think, was always going to favor Oryx over, say, ogres or grots or something like that. There's just something about being removed from the situation and being a beacon that everyone can unify around that gives Kragnos his own power. And in doing so, he sets off hordes of all of these factions. Gloomspite gets Roven everywhere, ogres trying to eat everything, Sons of Behemoth, Oryx of all different kinds of war clans. It's just madness. And so, yeah, life is booming, but it takes time for the fruits of that life, meaning entropy and the natural cycles of decay, to take root. So Nurgle is seeing a lot of potential, but it's not coming yet because it takes time. What he is seeing in the meantime, however, is a lot of martial resistance because these warbands are surging everywhere, punching everything that they can see. And so that old, slow, implacable warband that just didn't quit before isn't working. Because in the era of the beast, it's getting assaulted and chipped away by these warbands of Oryx and Maw tribes and everything. It's just chipping them away, and so they just kind of collapse in on themselves at a certain point. Maybe they go through the wrong, neighborhood, so to speak, and the area is turned into a thick swamp, and they really struggle to move through that, like physically walk through it because they're so fat and bulky, and the ground kind of eats them up. Like, there's just a lot of ways that war clans in particular can mess with Maggotkin from a lore perspective. However, Nurgle is adaptable, and some of the best champions are as well. Because the little micro story that we have here, without even giving any names or anything, is just some warband leaders, they take small forces that are highly contagious, they go out, and they just fight enough to get every one of their opponents sick. And then they just run away. They just retreat. And so what's interesting is that from a Nurgle perspective, that's not really how they fight. They're not a hit and run force, right? You're thinking that's how the Sylvaneth fight Nurgle, not how Nurgle fights anybody else. But it's for a purpose. Because, of course, when they did that fight and then retreated to a corrupted place to where the orcs didn't really want to go, gave them a little bit of a reprieve. It shored up some of the number losses that Nurgle was having by keeping their losses minimal from an army perspective. But the diseases that they infected upon those warbands are now being carried by those warbands further and wider than Nurgle forces ever could. They're essentially using them as like the disease demons of Postmates, just sending them everywhere. And this is interesting because it requires a few things from the disease itself. It has to be highly transmissible. It has to be carryable, meaning there's not going to be like so much natural resistance that it dies out in transit while it's on the orc. And then it also needs to be devastating when it gets there, but not immediately to kill the host carrying it to the next objective. It needs to kind of be a sleeper disease. They fight the orcs. The orcs now have enough time to keep the infection going, move to the next location, infect that populace, and it destroys that. Whether or not the orcs are immune to whatever this disease is, that would be the perfect thing. If they were like an immune carrier of all these things, that would be a blast for Nurgle. But that's all speculation. Really what we're getting at is that a lot of the warlords are starting to adapt. How do we survive in the era of the beast? Well, we have these territories. We've already corrupted and claimed them. Nobody wants them, which is good for us, right? You have some hidey place to go back to, these corrupted lands. But instead of just marching massive armies out there and showing martial force, which Nurgle was never super into before either, instead, let's play it smart. We're going to use these new enemies as our own disease vectors, new ways to introduce things into the population. Maybe our battle plans before the Rite of Life were to go attack, and this city, I'm going to make one up, Greywall. Or we were going to go siege Greywall, but now this orc warband is already doing it. Well, heck, why don't we just give you guys some diseases, whether through working with a shaman and infecting some of his dudes, like a parlay kind of deal, or just straight fighting you and infecting you the old-fashioned way, and then sending you that way. We still get the end result that we want. The city will be destroyed, it will be full of plague, and it will be madness, but now it's 2 birds, 1 stone. And if on top of that we lose fewer Nurgle guys by doing that than marching the whole army out, this is all wins. Everything's coming up Millhouse. But keep in mind, that is only for the generals who adapt. because I'm sure we will find stories in this book, and there are actually ones after that specific tale, of just people going out and getting slaughtered because they're not reading the room, right? They're not paying attention to how things have changed. The realms are so much more dangerous now. Nurgle is used to coming into an area, infecting it so utterly and completely that there's not much natural resistance to them outside of other factions. But with the Right of Life, flora and fauna are booming so intensely that it's not a given that you can just be safe by your mere presence of disease. And so it's the warlords who can use their brains, not monetize, but work with other factions to get these diseases out there as best they can, to use their enemies rather than being used. It just makes them fantastic. And in the end, Nurgle is always happy, right? He loves it. And so I want to end this video like I end all of them, just kind of chatting every once in a while about why I love this, right? What makes this story so stinking cool? Well, for me, the Chaos Gods are something that some lore readers really love the stagnancy of them. Like, that's kind of their asset, that they are this eternal, primordial enemy. They don't change, with the exception of Tzeentch, who doesn't change in his ever-changingness, paradoxically. But with Nurgle here, what we're getting a sense of, like, the craftiness of these Chaos Warband leaders. Like, Nurgle may not change, he likes disease and disease is spreading, but the craftiness of their followers has to adapt, and seeing that is actually really cool. It's one of those things, like, we start to see factions who, here's a new threat, and then another faction has to do something, invent something, or come up with a way to compensate, and then they innovate their own thing, and then the enemy has to innovate again. And so this all happens in real life. World War I was full of these kinds of very, I'm going to call them tragic innovations of warfare, of kind of like getting the upper hand and wrestling it from your opponent. The craftiest people are the ones who rise to the top, who can walk in, assess a situation, and formulate a practical solution. And so when you talk about on a warband level, what is our mission? It's not to fight and kill. That's not what Nurgle is about. It's about the disease and the spread and the corruption. So, with that being our goal, instead of fighting, how can we use what is in our toolbox here, meaning the roving warbands around you, your safety spot within the corrupted lands? Like, let's just start using our resources more wisely and adapt to the situation, and we will have greater gains in the end. And when you have that kind of like inspirational and positive outlook on things, but you apply it to something that is so horrifying and patently evil, like chaos corruption, it becomes this very interesting story. You can start to see, these very villainous characters that are probably very interesting to learn about, coming up with these crazy plans that you're like, well, that makes sense, but it shouldn't because it's terrible, but it does kind of, it clicks. And to me, like, that's what the best depictions of Chaos Warlords are. I also really liked the way that they did that with the Call of Archaon series. Like, those warlords are not just muscle and going out and ramming your army across the plains of Gur. Instead, it's just, who's the smartest person? Who can figure this puzzle out? That's who Khorne wants. That's who Nurgle, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, or Archaon want. Those are the heroes that stand out, and those are the characters that are enjoyable to follow. So friends, let me know your thoughts. If you have backstory for your own particular, plague legion, so to speak, let me know your thoughts on what's going on with the overall setting. Is Nurgle pleased with your warband, and how are they adapting to the new era of the beast? I'd love to read it in the comments down below. Everyone, thank you so much for watching and listening, and I'll catch you in my next Age of Sigmar lore video. Happy wargaming.